Welcome back once again to our reading of the Mortification of Sin by John Owen. We're in chapter 7. It's titled Rules for Mortification. A. Faith. Starting from chapter 5, we have been discussing the practical aspects of overcoming our sinful tendencies. To answer the question of how a person can overcome their inherent sin, we're looking at three main topics. 1. Explain what it means to overcome any sin, both in terms of what it isn't, chapter 5, and what it is, chapter 6, so we don't get the foundation wrong. 2. Provide general guidance for the essential things that must be in place for anyone to truly and spiritually overcome any sin. And 3. Outline specific actions to achieve this. Now we are focusing on the second topic, that is, the ways and means by which a person can work on overcoming a particular sin that Satan uses to cause distress and weaken them. First, we need to establish some general principles and foundations for this work, without which no one in the world can achieve it, even if they are deeply convicted and determined to overcome a specific sin. The general rules and principles needed for overcoming any sin are as follows. 1. Believe. Belief is necessary for overcoming sin. The first rule. A. Unless a person is a believer truly connected to Christ, they can never overcome any single sin. I don't mean that they need to know for sure that they are connected to Christ, but they must actually be connected. Overcoming sin is the work of believers as seen in Romans 8:13 and Colossians 3:5. Unbelievers may attempt something similar, but they can never truly do the work in a way that is acceptable to God. Even philosophers like Seneca, Tully, and Epictetus, who spoke about overcoming worldly desires and passions, couldn't achieve true spiritual transformation. The same goes for those who follow religious rituals and practices, like the papists with their vows, penances, and satisfactions. They try to overcome sin, but don't achieve it because they rely on their own efforts instead of faith. This is also true for those who attempt to leave sin behind based on their own convictions and awakened consciences. 2. The Spirit is needed. It is true that everyone who hears the law or gospel preached should work on overcoming sin. It's their duty, but it's not their immediate duty. They must first do something else to enable them to do it. I've shown that only the Spirit can overcome sin, and all other means without Him are empty and vain. How can someone overcome sin if they don't have the Spirit? It's impossible to truly overcome even one sin without the Spirit. So how do we receive the Spirit? The Spirit is given to those who belong to Christ, Romans 8:9. Therefore, if we belong to Christ and have a connection with Him, then we have the Spirit and the power to overcome sin. The Apostle Paul discusses this in depth in Romans 8:8-11. Any attempts to overcome sin without being connected to Christ are futile. 3. Human efforts fail. Many people troubled by their sins and convicted by Christ's teachings try hard to fight against specific sins that have caused them the most distress or confusion. But unfortunately, they are working in vain. When the Spirit of Christ comes to help in this work, He purifies and cleanses people like gold and silver, Malachi 3:2-3. However, people must already have a core of gold and silver, or else the refining process won't help them. The prophet tells us the unfortunate outcome of wicked people's attempts at self-improvement, no matter what means God provides them. The bellows are burned, the lead is consumed of the fire, the founder melteth in vain. Reprobate silver shall men call them, because the Lord has rejected them. Jeremiah 6:29-30. And why is this? They were brass and iron when they were put into the furnace, verse 28. People can try to refine brass and iron for a very long time, but they'll never become good silver. So I'm saying that self-improvement is not the main concern for unregenerate people. God doesn't call them to it yet. Their job is to convert their entire soul, not just to improve this or that specific flaw. You'd laugh at someone who tried to build a huge structure without laying a proper foundation, especially if they kept making the same mistake after experiencing their building collapse time and time again. It's the same with people who are aware of their flaws. Even though they see that they lose ground against their sins one day and regain it the next, they continue down the same path without questioning what's holding them back. The Scriptures. When the Jews convicted of their sins were deeply troubled and cried out, "What shall we do?" Acts 2:37. How does Peter guide them? Does he tell them to go and improve their pride, anger, malice, cruelty, and so on? No. He knows that it's not their main task right now. Instead, he calls them to conversion and faith in Christ in general, verse 38. First, let the soul be fully converted, and then, looking on him who they pierced, John 19:37, humility and self-improvement will follow. So when John came to preach repentance and conversion, he said, "Now also the axe is laid to the root of the trees," Matthew 3:10. The Pharisees had been imposing heavy burdens, tedious duties, and strict means of self-improvement through fasting, washing, and the like, all in vain. John essentially says, the teaching of conversion is for you. The axe in my hand is laid to the root. Our Savior tells us that what needs to be done in this situation, asking, "Do men gather grapes from thorns?" Matthew 7:16. But what if a thorn bush is well pruned and cared for? It still won't bear figs. Neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Verses 17 and 18. It's inevitable that every tree will produce fruit according to its nature. So what should be done? He tells us, make the tree good, and its fruit will be good. Matthew 12:33. The root must be dealt with. The nature of the tree must be changed, or no good fruit will be produced. This is my point. Unless a person is born again, unless they are a believer, all their attempts at self-improvement are useless, no matter how appealing or promising they may seem. All the methods they can use are pointless, even if they follow them with great diligence, earnestness, watchfulness, and intention of mind and spirit. They will try many remedies in vain. They will not be healed. Negative effects on unbelievers who attempt self-improvement. There are several hopeless problems that come with trying to perform this duty for people who are convinced of their sins, but are not believers. 1. They are distracted from seeking Christ. When an unbeliever focuses on improving their flaws, their mind and soul are occupied with something that isn't their main concern, and they are diverted from what truly matters. God uses His word and judgments to confront them with their sin, causing their conscience to ache, their heart to be troubled, and their peace to be disturbed. Now other distractions won't help. They must address the issue at hand. The task is to awaken the whole person to the state and condition they are in, so they can be brought closer to God. But instead, they focus on improving the sin that troubles them, which is the result of self-love and wanting to be free from their problems, rather than addressing the work they are called to do. In doing so, they are diverted from it. This is one of the most common deceptions that lead people to ruin their own souls. I wish that some who claim to be experts in spiritual matters didn't teach this deception and cause people to be misled by their ignorance. Ezekiel 13:10-14. What do people do, and what they are often advised to do, when their consciences are tormented by sin and disturbed by the Lord who confronts them? Isn't it to practically abandon the sin that troubles them and fight against it? And isn't the true purpose of their convictions lost in the process? Here people remain stuck and ultimately perish. False confidence. This responsibility is a good thing in itself, in its proper place, a duty that shows sincerity and brings peace to the conscience. Therefore, a person who is truly committed to it, their mind and heart set against a particular sin, with the intention and determination to avoid it, may assume that their state and condition is good, and thus deceive themselves. A. False quieting of the conscience. However, when a person's conscience is troubled by sin, and they can't find peace, instead of going to the great physician of souls and finding healing in his blood, they try to calm their conscience by fighting against sin, without turning to Christ at all. Sadly, many people are misled in this way for eternity. When Ephraim saw his sickness, he sent to King Jerob, Hosea 5:13. which kept him away from God. The entire bundle of the popish religion is made up of schemes to pacify the conscience without Christ, all described by the apostle in Romans 10:3. B. Self-righteous satisfaction. By attempting to overcome sin, people convince themselves that their state and condition is good because they're doing something that is good in itself and not doing it for show. They believe they are acting sincerely, and so they become hardened in a kind of self-righteousness. C. Giving up. When a person has been deceived in this way for a while and realizes that their sin is not truly overcome, or if they have merely replaced one sin with another, they eventually start to think that all their efforts are in vain. They believe they will never succeed and are only trying to hold back a flood that keeps growing. As a result, they give up, despairing of any success, and surrender to the power of sin and the habit of formality that they have fallen into. This is the usual outcome of people who try to overcome sin without first having a relationship with Christ. It deceives them, hardens them, and destroys them. That's why there are often no more vile and desperate sinners in the world than those who, having been convicted and tried this course, have found it fruitless and abandoned it without discovering Christ. This is the essence of the religion and godliness of the most dedicated formalists in the world, and of all those in the Roman synagogue who are drawn to mortification, just as the Indians are driven to baptism or cattle to water. I say then that mortification is the work of believers, and believers only. To kill sin is the work of living people. Where people are dead, as all unbelievers, even the best of them, are dead, sin is alive and will live. Work of faith. It is the unique work of faith. If there is a task that can only be accomplished by one instrument, it is utter madness for anyone who doesn't have that instrument to attempt it. It is the faith that purifies the heart, Acts 15:9. Or as Peter says, you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit, 1 Peter 1:22. And without faith, it won't be done. I believe what has been said is enough to support my first general rule. Be sure to have a relationship with Christ. If you try to overcome any sin without it, it will never be done. 3. Objection. What should the unregenerate do? You might ask, what should unregenerate people do when they are convinced of the evil of sin? Should they stop fighting against sin, live recklessly, indulge their desires, and be as bad as the worst of people? This would be a way to plunge the whole world into chaos, to bring everything into darkness, to open the floodgates of lust, and to let people rush into all sin with delight and greed, like a horse charging into battle. Answer 1. God forbid. Romans 6:1 and 2. It should be seen as a great result of God's wisdom, goodness, and love that he uses various ways and means to restrain people from running wild with the excess and debauchery that their corrupt nature would otherwise drive them to with violence. Whatever method is used, it is the result of God's care, kindness, and goodness, without which the whole earth would be a hell of sin and confusion. Answer 2. There is a unique convicting power in the Word, which God often uses to wound, amaze, and in some ways humble sinners, even if they are never converted. The Word should be preached even if it has this effect, but not with this goal in mind. If the Word is preached, people's sins will be rebuked, lust will be restrained, and some opposition will be made against sin, even if that is not the intended effect. Answer 3. Although this is the work of the Word and Spirit, and it is good in itself, it is not beneficial or effective for its main purpose in those who experience it. They are still in the gall of bitterness and under the power of darkness. Answer 4. Let people know that it is their duty, but in its proper place. I don't take people away from mortification, but direct them toward conversion. A person is not an enemy if they call someone away from fixing a hole in their house's wall to put out a fire that is consuming the entire building. Poor soul, it's not your sore finger, but your consuming fever that you need to address. You focus on fighting a particular sin without realizing that you are entirely sinful. 4. To preachers. Let me add this for those who preach the word or intend to do so with God's guidance. It is their duty to confront people about their sins and focus on specific sins. But always remember that the ultimate goal of both law and gospel is to reveal the sinner's state and condition. Otherwise, they might only lead people to formality and hypocrisy without achieving the true purpose of preaching the gospel. It's not enough to simply stop someone from being a drunkard and turn them into a sober formalist. A skilled preacher goes to the root of the problem and addresses the heart. Ecclesiastes 12:11. Confronting specific sins of ignorant, unregenerate people, like those that fill our land, is a good work. However, if the only result of preaching is that people diligently try to mortify their sins being preached against, it's like defeating an enemy in an open field, only to drive them into an impregnable castle. When you reprove a sinner for any particular sin, use it to address their overall state and condition, and deal with them accordingly. Breaking people away from specific sins without breaking their hearts deprives us of opportunities to truly help them. This is where the Roman approach to mortification is deeply flawed. They push all sorts of people toward mortification without considering whether they have the right foundation for it. In fact, they don't even call people to believe so they can mortify their lusts. They call them to mortification instead of believing. The truth is, they don't understand what it means to believe or what mortification really entails. Their faith is just a general agreement with the teachings of their church, and their mortification is a vow to follow a certain lifestyle that involves some self-denial, but with a significant compensation. Such people don't truly know the Scriptures or the power of God, and their boasting of mortification is just glorying in their shame. Some advisors among us also overlook the necessity of regeneration and confidently tell everyone who complains of any sin or lust to make a vow against it for a certain period, like a month. These people seem to have very little understanding of the gospel's mystery, similar to Nicodemus when he first came to Christ, John 3. They tell people to vow to abstain from sin for a while, which often makes the lust even stronger. They might keep their vow, but with great difficulty, or they might break it, increasing their guilt and torment. Does this really mortify their sin? Do they conquer it? Does their condition change even if they manage to give up the sin? Aren't they still in a bitter state? Isn't this like asking people to make bricks without straw, or worse, without strength? Exodus 5:7. What promise or assistance does an unregenerate person have for this to work? Can sin be killed without a connection to Christ's death or mortified without the Spirit? Even if such directions could change people's lives, which they rarely do, they don't change their hearts or conditions. They might make people self-righteous or hypocritical, but not true Christians. It often saddens me to see sincere people with zeal for God and a desire for eternal well-being kept under a hard, burdensome external worship and service of God all their days by such advisors and directions. They may have many seemingly good attempts at mortification, but they remain ignorant of Christ's righteousness and is unfamiliar with His Spirit. I know too many people in situations like this. If God ever shines into their hearts to give them the knowledge of His glory in the face of His Son Jesus Christ, they will see the folly of their current ways. 2 Corinthians 4:6.